Hi everyone. I wanted to do a video today on some fairy tales. If you know me at all, you know that I love the fairy tales. I even am starting an adult fairy tale circle because, as some of you may already know, the fairy tales were originally for adult audiences, and they were a lot more gruesome and a lot darker than they are today. But I wanted to go through some of the books that I have as well that are really good sources. Sorry, I got a hair on my mouth. For the fairy tales. When I do a fairy tale circle, I usually focus on one fairy tale. Sometimes I'll just focus on fairy tales in general. Because fairy tales have traveled all over the world, so there's many versions of the same kind of fairy tale. And when I do the fairy tale circle and I'm focusing specifically on a certain fairy tale, I talk about the history and the different versions there are of it and all that kind of stuff. So let me get started with one of the classics. So I found this, I was really lucky and found this book, The Glass Slipper, in a used bookstore, but I'm sure it's still in print and available. I think it was first published in the 1980s, but it's originally the Charles Perrault version of fairy tales. So he was one of the first people to put fairy tales into writing outside of the Story of Ocean, which is actually the oldest collection of fairy tales in the world. It was written in Sanskrit. It was written in a different language before then that's very hard to understand and basically a dead language, but it got rewritten in Sanskrit in like the year 1000 kind of thing. It's a collection of Indian fairy tales from India, but Charles Perrault is a French author. He worked in Louis XIV's court, and he collected a lot of the folk tales around France and Europe at that time, and he would tell them in the salons of Europe and in particular in the French salons and stuff like that. But this is a really cool book to have. It's The Glass Slipper. So The Glass Slipper is his version of Cinderella. So what's kind of interesting is a lot of people, when they think of fairy tales, they think of the Grimm's brothers. And when they think of older fairy tales, they think of the Grimm's brothers. But the Grimm's brothers are actually considered a modern collection of fairy tales. So that tells you how far back some of these fairy tales go. Like I said, they go back thousands of years. You know, it's been theorized that, you know, they probably started, you know, when we were cave people around the fires of our caves to tell stories to each other kind of thing. But the nice thing, like I said, this is The Glass Slipper. This is Charles Perrault's version of Cinderella, and he wrote his collection in 1697. So that's going back a ways. And when you think of Cinderella, it's his version that you're thinking of. That's the Disney version with the fairy godmother and the pumpkin. However, when the Grimm's brothers wrote their version, well, collected their version, they didn't actually write any of the stories. They would take the folk tales and then massage them, so to speak. But when they collected their version of Cinderella, the title of their story is Cinderella, but it's a very different Cinderella than what we think of when we think of Cinderella. And we've since taken Perrault's version of Cinderella and added Grimm's title of Cinderella to the Glass Slipper story. And we kind of did the opposite with Little Red Riding Hood. Because with Little Red Riding Hood, we know the Grimm's version of Little Red Riding Hood, but their version of Little Red Riding Hood is actually called Little Red Cap. And Perrault's version of Little Red Riding Hood is called Little Red Riding Hood. So we've taken his title and the Grimm's story and we've mashed those two things together. So a lot of influence came from him, and I go into his history, and there's a little bit of history in here too with this book actually, which is kind of neat. Now another book that I came across again in a used bookstore was called The Fabrics of Fairy Tale. And what I really like about this book is it's fairy tales from all over the world. So there's fairy tales from Africa, there's a Swedish one, Swahili, Chinese, Hawaiian, Indonesia, there's a Jewish one. So there's quite a few different tales that you've never heard of, or at least I've never heard of, and they're really interesting. And what's really cool is, I'm just getting to a page here, so carpet weaving in Persia, for instance, they give you the history of each of the fabrics, and the fabric that they talk about is focused on that next fairy tale. They go into the silk, and they go into flax linen and things like that, and how it's made and the history of that fabric, and then there's a fairy tale that goes along with it. So I thought that was really kind of neat, and it's an old fairy tale. It's not something that's made up. They actually are fairy tales. Now I got this as a gift from my beautiful daughter because she knows I love fairy tales. So I got this as a Christmas present one year. And it's a collection of Andersen and Grimm versions of fairy tales. So there's a lot of different people that have written different kinds of fairy tales. So these are some of the classic, like Hans Christian Andersen did things like The Ugly Duckling, The Little Mermaid, The Little Match Girl. Sometimes his get really sad. And then, of course, the Grimm's brothers actually have a lot more fairy tales than most people think. I think there was over 300 fairy tales in their final publishing. Now, they first came out, the Grimm's version, in 1812. And then I think it was 1856 or somewhere around there that the second version of the Grimm's collection of fairy tales came out. Now, they removed a lot of the fairy tales, especially the darker ones that were in the 1812 version. The 1856 or 57, I can't remember which year it was, version was actually the first version to be translated to English. And by that point, sort of the morals of the day and the church and things had kind of had a bit of an influence. So they actually toned down a lot of the fairy tales, even the ones that they left in their fairy tale collections. And the Grimms actually didn't start out collecting fairy tales because they liked fairy tales. They collected fairy tales because they were afraid that the Germanic language was going to get lost, and they were trying to preserve the Germanic language. So that's what they were doing. They were collecting the folk and fairy tales of the day to try and preserve the language. And they actually died while they were creating a dictionary of German words. They ended on the letter F. That's how far they got. And they were very close brothers. I can't remember exactly when the first one died, but 3 years later the brother followed him. And like I said, they ended on the letter F in their big Germanic dictionary that they were creating and writing. Now I do have a couple other ones. I have this one that I found at a yard sale. It came to me duct taped together. These are very hard to find, and I think they're out of print now, but this is Hilda Boswell's Treasury of Nursery Rhymes. She's an amazing artist. She's since passed away, but these are books that I grew up on. I remember this one, and nursery rhymes are very important, as important I say as the fairy tales. So I love this book. It's full of nonsensical kind of fairy tales, but there's a lot of not fairy tales, sorry, poetry and nursery rhymes, and like Patty Cake and Mary Mary Quite Contrary. And I'm finding kids don't know their nursery rhymes the way we did when we were growing up. Little Miss Muffet, Little Tommy Tucker, Here We Go Round the Mulberry Bush, all those kind of things. But there's often history behind the nursery rhymes too. I haven't delved into that as much because I'm into the fairy tales right now, and like I said, that's what I'm going to be focusing on for my circles at Goddess Garage. So if you ever want to join, or if you would like one of my books that I do for each fairy tale, I've done Little Red Riding Hood and I'm working on Cinderella right now. Feel free to follow me on Facebook because that's where I'm at, Rhonda, or Goddess Garage Tarot Parlor. And then I bought this book. And again, these books are out of print, so I paid a dear price for this one, but I'm so happy I have it. So it's her Treasury of Poetry. This is the book I grew up on, and I just love all the little pictures. There's the Raggle Taggle Gypsies, which is an awesome poem. I love it. It's about a woman running away from her husband, the king. There's the Santa Claus one. And the artwork is just awesome. There's Santa Claus there, you know, delivering the toys to the children. There was one that's called, there's some sad ones in here too, but there's some fun ones. There's Wink and Blink and a Nod, for instance. I love Wink and Blink and a Nod. Always puts me to sleep, which is the point. The Babes in the Wood, that's a little bit like Hansel and Gretel, but they didn't get out of the woods or find the gingerbread house. It's a sad one. I fell in love with mermaids as a little kid when I had this poem, The Mermaid, and I always imagined myself brushing my hair under the water. It would be so nice. So this is a beautiful book. I love this. Oh, and they went to sea in a sieve. That's a beautiful. It's such a fun poem, and it's a great book. I love this book, and I was read by my parents and by relatives that book many times over. And then there's the modern fairy tale, because I like some of the twists that happen in modern fairy tales too. I bought a book, I don't have it here with me, because it was when my children were young, and I bought the book, which is about the three little pigs, but it's from the wolf's point of view, and he tries to justify why he did what he did and why he was blowing their houses down and all that kind of stuff. It was hilarious to read. It was so much fun. And then I just recently purchased this one, and it's Seriously, Cinderella is So Annoying. And they actually have a whole series of this, and it's a really neat twist, because this is the Cinderella story, but from the stepmother's point of view. And if you've read any fairy tales, you know that stepmothers kind of get a bad rap in fairy tales, and I do talk about that in my Cinderella adults story time circle. And they also have in this one, I think they have the big bad wolf again, but it's with Little Red Riding Hood and why he did what he did. I haven't read that one, but this one was pretty funny actually. She did justify why everything happened. It seemed to make sense in her perspective, and she was talking about how Cinderella was very annoying, so I really enjoyed the read. It was nice and quick because obviously it's a kid's book. I also have a little Hansel and Gretel one. I always like the magic of Hansel and Gretel. Like I always dreamed of finding that gingerbread house and eating it, and you know, it being so delicious. And then I have another classic here. Now this isn't really a fairy tale, it's Heidi, but I fell in love with this book as a girl. You know, I just love the idea of being out in the mountains and herding the sheep and the goats and things like that, and all the things that she did with her grandfather or her uncle, whoever it was. I can't quite remember. It's been a while since I've read it. But I really enjoyed this book. So I just wanted to go through some of the children's fairy tale books that I have and talk to you a little bit about fairy tales, because fairy tales, like I said, they travel the world. There's great meaning in fairy tales, and I believe it was a quote from Albert Einstein who said, it's important to read the fairy tales to your children, because the fairy tales have been said to be part of our collective conscience. They bring in many archetypes that we have to deal with in life. They give you hope, and they only started to actually enter the children's realm after Charles Perrault put it to print. It was the first sort of mass production of fairy tales, so it became more available to people outside of, you know, a storyteller coming into the village and telling the story of Little Red Riding Hood or the Sleeping Beauty or whatever. But it does, and there's a lot of fairy tales too that have the females as heroines. I know there's a lot of bashing that goes on about, you know, the helpless princess and whatnot. But actually, there is a point to it as well, and I do talk about that in the fairy tale circles. And like I said, it brings in a lot of those archetypes that we have to deal with in life and lessons that we're going to learn. And when it hit kind of the children's realm, it also gives us hope, right? It shows us that there's things beyond us, because there's that magical element. Because there's usually fairies in the stories. I believe Little Red Riding Hood is one of the only fairy tales that does not have any magical element to it. and the only magical kind of element it has is a talking wolf. But outside of that, there's no fairies, there's no royalty, there's no magic spells or anything like that, unlike other fairy tales where there does tend to be those things. But what the fairy tales do tend to teach us is that we can overcome, because oftentimes there's sort of an underdog or there's a challenge that's happening, and it shows us that even in dire circumstances we can overcome, because often they're coming from a child's point of view, and we can all identify with that child because we all once were that child. So there's a lot of lessons to be learned in fairy tales. There's a lot of history in fairy tales, and that's what I'm hoping to share in my fairy tale circles. So I hope that you'll be able to join me for one of those circles. Please look me up on Facebook at Goddess Garage Tarot Parlor. I also do tarot readings as well, and I do bring in the fairy tales into my tarot readings a lot too. So I hope you enjoyed this little video, and I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye.